I think I'm going to share the file in the chat, and everyone should be able to access it because it's an open session. And then I might spotlight myself in the file, or would you prefer it if I share my screen? It's up to you. I kind of want to be able to see people.
Spotlight.
Okay, great. Thank you. I will spotlight myself and everyone should be able to follow me. And then I'm just going to set my screen up so I can see both things at the same time. Actually, I do need to share my screen. I'll do that at some point. Okay, I'll just do that now. Let's get it out of the way.
So I would like to ask before we continue, the questions on Luma, would you like me to read them out or I should put them in the chat?
It's okay. I will just jump through. I'll jump through the questions. I'll zip through them and probably bounce around some of them.
All right, sure.
Okay, everyone ready? Let's go. Let's talk about design systems. Let's do it.
Yay.
All right. The order of the questions is probably nicely set up to go from lighter to heavier, I guess, in here. And I might just zip through because there's some of these ones I think we can clear up very quickly. So let's take Yusuf's question straight away and like why a design system is important. It's quite an existential question. So I'll jump in and just be effectively why is design important? Why is engineering important? And why is business important? Those sound kind of obvious. So I think there's a knock-on effect for why a design system is important. In fact, right now, systems thinking is more important than ever because as we're entering a world of generated designs and tech, you have to have consistency and efficiency. Without that, your product will look and feel worse. So right now if you would have asked me this question 3 months ago, I would have said, I don't know, actually. I'm feeling a little bit scared about what design systems mean. But right now, I'm confident that there is a larger need for more design system thinking, whether that is manifesting in a system itself or just the way you approach work. I'm very confident in that way. So that's why it's important because everything's getting automated. We have to build consistency into our process. So I'm just going to give that a little thumbs up. We can come back to it if you want. Okay. Product designer on design system team. Keeping a Figma library light while still providing useful and complex components. Your system uses atomic components. Firstly, I think atomic design is dead. I've written about this, so I'll just link this article in the file and you can have a read because I think that it's kind of a bit dated. It doesn't necessarily work for design and development and we've moved on from that. So I think that we are in a different place. However, the central question is like keeping things simple. It would be actually probably useful if Grace is on the call, if you could drop in an example of what you're working on or what your system kind of looks like. I could take a look. But what I would generally say is, so in this like mini component set thing that I built once, I made heavy use of what I called fragments. And they were basically like extensions of a component that were optional. So a select or an option or a drop down or a menu or a navigation list or whatever is a really good example of something that people typically want to extend if they need to customize it. Like a select menu, you might just need the default version and a couple of options in every single design you need, or you might want to build your own, in which case you can extend it with a fragment. So this is an optional extension to that central component. Whether that is like a composed version or it's a bunch of different options, you can make your own. The extension, this extension, or maybe a consolidation, is to use a slot component-based approach to design systems. I'd say use that with caution, just because it's not necessarily as scalable as it sounds. But let me just jump back to the file. This also links into design library structure. And this is where I think using more than one library is probably going to be your friend. So you'd naturally have something like a foundations library with like variables and styles. And then I'd say you probably got a components, and just scaling up, this is components library. And then you might have a templates library or a patterns library. And this gives you an optionality as a designer in your design file. To take in whatever you need. So you're going to have the variables, you're going to have the components, and maybe you want some other things or not, depending on what you're working on. And this conceptually is the same method for platform-specific components or patterns. So you might have an iOS-specific library that you need only for a certain project. And that's how you can keep the lean system locked away, and then it's optional libraries that you can plug and play into your designs as and when you need them. So a combination of stuff there, and then have a read of this just to see like what I'm thinking about on the leanness of the component. I'm aware I'm talking pretty fast because I realize we have about 2 million questions that I'm going to try and get through. If I'm talking too fast, let me know. If you want me to say anything again, also let me know. And feel free to come off mute at any moment and just interrupt me. If this is back and forth, that'd be amazing.
I'm going to bother you.
Yeah, sorry?
Yeah, you said come out of mute.
Yeah, great,
so
thank you.
In this structure, because we came into like realization that when we have the components library inside, and we also have all the UI kit components.
Yeah.
So it can get like extremely heavy and like very hard to document.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is like in this structure, so the UI kit is basically in the patterns library?
So this is an if and when moment. Patterns is probably the wrong word here. It probably would be something like template. And what I mean by template is if you go up to the level of something like this, if you're building this level of component that people like drop in and into their file, this is really heavy and it's going to bloat your library up. And that to me is a natural split into something else of like templates library, because not everybody's going to need this. And this might not be the best example. A more common example is something like a table or a data table, where they can get really, really heavy in your file and bog down the whole experience. So to me, if I'm going to be working on a data table project, I need the data table components. If I'm working on a non-data table project, I probably don't need them. So we can split those up into their own library, perhaps with their own variables and styles and type settings as well. In effect, like data tables or tables can become their own mini system. People buy off-the-shelf libraries for tables, and that is packaged in its own right. It has its own release schedule, it has its own style even. So that to me is like a separate system. And maybe a more common example is like forms. So like common form patterns, they can probably live close to your main library if they're very common. If this becomes like 100 examples, that to me suggests that maybe you might want to consider splitting it up or rethinking how we built that system in its first place. If you're constantly creating new form elements to keep up with the demand of the design team, that to me means maybe we need to empower the design team to make their own components. And they might live locally in their team. So that's when we start talking about a different setup entirely. So if we take this again, this, let's say this is in like main design system project, and then I have a tables library. This might live in its own project, like tables or data or whatever. Alternatively, you might have an iOS project only for the iOS designers and engineers. iOS. Alternatively, you might have a platform level library. So if I'm working specifically on onboarding, you might have a library just for onboarding. And with that like horizontal expansion, is definitely like a larger team problem or a larger team exploration, but it's something that you just might need to do as you expand. As you're starting out, which like this questions kind of are hinting at, like starting systems, then one file for everything is totally fine. The one thing I just would say is that you cannot move variables and keep them connected to a component. So that is a central problem that cannot be solved. So just bear that in mind. Anytime you're making anything, you can move components around, which actually makes things fine, but you can't move variables. So planning that ahead of schedule is going to save you a lot of time. Okay. Question from Bless here about, could you teach us how to create a design system? I am struggling with this one because you already have one, whether you know or not. And it might just be that you're at a different phase of development. So if we look at like phase 1 to, let's break this down to like 4 phases. Phase 1, you've probably just got like a Figma file. It might just have some components in it, or some styles or variables, and your designs, they might all be in the same file. You might be on the free plan and just have everything in one file. That's still a design system. It's still like a language that you're describing your approach to designing in. Phase 2 might be like libraries. Phase 3 might be libraries plus documentation plus code. And then phase 4 is like multi-brand public facing system. And what people typically look at in this one is like Shopify Polaris as being the gold standard of public facing design systems. So this is like phase 4. However, I would say that Polaris is only used in one aspect or one part of Shopify. Not every single product in Shopify uses Polaris. So if that gives you an indication about like how small or large systems can become, is that you can have a massive company with a very well-known design system for the admin part of that product. So when we go back to that original question, that's where you start to get these like templated, split up different parts of a system. How to build a system, like I said, you already have one. I'm just going to show you, like I'm working at the moment on a UI kit that basically replicates Notion, and because I have really too much time on my hands. And this is what the file looks like. This is messy as hell, but this is still technically a design system. You know, there's components in here. There's variables in here. These can be exported, they can be built, they can be coded. There's templates in here, like it's an entire page made of components. But someone wouldn't call this a design system in air quotes, but I would, because it's still part of all of this. And you're just like progressing across this phase. And that's not to say that you always need to go along this phase. You might just be totally fine in phase 2. This probably has code as well, to be honest. Figma, in fact, was at phase 2 for a very long time until there was a business requirement to move up in fidelity. And that business requirement was more products. So typically the expansion of a business and creating more things to be supported will move you up this list or up this scale. Question 2 on here is, why do we need to make it flexible? I would challenge that statement, actually. Sometimes it doesn't need to be flexible. Sometimes it needs to be very fixed. Like this is an input field for the error state versus here's an input field that you can do everything with. Because that's when we actually lose adoption in a design system. If we have something that can do too many things, then people are not going to know what to do with it. And I've got an example of that later with a different question. And I think like this one I've kind of covered. How do we maintain and grow them? That is just an organic process. As the business grows, like I said, you will have a requirement for more components. You'll have a requirement for more documentation. And that as you like become more confident in business, you can start to move that out. Bruno, your hand up.
Hey, hi Luis. Sorry to interrupt. I just would add something more on what can a design system be, because it can be much more. There are a talk from, I guess it was Schema or Config, from the design system manager, Brainly, that was talking about the multidimensional on design systems. So we can talk much more. We can involve branding, marketing, and so on. But that's a whole world, right?
Yes. So a really good example of that is wise.com.
Yeah.
If you're not familiar, it's a financial startup, challenger startup, or they're much larger than a startup now. And they had a big rebrand from the design system out. And that I use this example all the time because people traditionally look at like the design system as being like product, and then we've got engineering, and then we've got like business stuff, and the design system's like over here, the thing that just gets done at some point in time. But maybe the design system can be like an agent for change, and that can encapsulate all these different aspects of a business outwards, because you can prove adoption, therefore prove consistency, therefore prove that user experience is improved. And because the design system will touch every single part of the business, you're able to brand from that outwards. So that wise.com case study is a really good one. I would also encourage you to read their documentation, because I think it's the best. So go and have a read of this is wise.design. Go and have a read of particularly their documentation on variables and tokens. It's really, really nice.
Well, maybe you can also add on that list the eBay playbook.
Yes, yeah, also very nice. Yeah, good call out. Thank you. Andy, how can a design system improve collaboration between the designers and developers? This one is about consistency, not in we're all using a button, but in reducing the design and engineering debt, like knowing you're using the right thing at the right time. An example of this, if I select this component and switch into dev mode, you can see that this is actually pulling all the code from the code base for that form. If I select a component on the inside, it's pulling the input field from the code base, input.tsx, from GitHub, last published 3 days ago. So when I'm therefore designing with this, an engineer knows exactly that this has already been built and it's this component, and they don't need to do anything. They just need to input it into that template. So to me, that is the whole like proof of the pudding, is that we can be confident on both sides that it's the right thing. So to me, that is like central. You reduce the headaches, you reduce the arguments, and can be more confident as a team that you're building the same thing in different places. What that also means that you reduce the need for documenting every single thing if it already exists. The second question has actually come up a bunch of times about like reusing existing systems or building your own thing. And that is a business decision. As you are, let's say you're starting a new company, you've got no money and you need to get to market, use an off-the-shelf system, totally fine. If you are an established company that wants to prove yourself as a brand differentiator in the market, that might be where you invest in your own custom system. But there are systems out there that are amazing and very flexible, that you can customize them. Like Tailwind, ShadCN, all that sort of stuff. You can use it off the shelf and make it look like yours, make it look like your brand, and it will get you very, very far. Like building this stuff by hand is very expensive. It takes a really long time. And you're building in dependencies internally that maybe you don't need yet. So I would say it's actually fine to use something off the shelf, with a caveat that not every public system is great. And they all have their own opinions on how to do things, which again, we'll touch on a little bit with someone else's question. The bonus question on here is, what advice would you give yourself if you were to start your career again? It would be to share more things earlier to everybody. It took me until like when I was 27 probably, to realize that community is actually very important for your career growth, and getting involved in communities like this and sharing your work is fundamental to your success. In fact, I wouldn't even be sitting here if I hadn't shared work online. So like, it was everything for me. And as like a funny example of this is, like I said, I'm building this like Notion kit in my spare time. And I just tweeted about, I remember someone saying Notion doesn't have a design system, so I'm making one myself. This is not finished. I published it anyway, share early and often. And then my friend was like, that somebody was actually the CEO of Notion. So firstly, I clearly forgot that the CEO had said that, but it's important that the CEO is saying that publicly to give us some kind of like test, like what's going on here. That then spurred a conversation later on where the original like head of design at Notion replied and said, which I think is really important, they have systems design, which matters way more than design system. And that is like profound for all of us to start thinking about. Hey, maybe we don't need this really high fidelity, public facing documentation website if we build into our team the idea of quality consistently at scale and polish every pixel. So this, where is it? This Notion thing. Let me try and find an example. Okay, so this this settings group, you'll see there's a spacer of 1 on it. That is so incredibly precise that that could only be done by somebody doing it by hand. And that means that the system's thinking is built into every single pixel, rather than a rule somewhere that says every single list item is built like this. Additionally, you've got like a 6. People love 8, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20. They're using a 6 because it works for them. They're not necessarily following some standard rules somewhere in the industry. They're building what makes sense for them. And that might be sometimes a 1 pixel gap between a list item. So I think that's just a really important like note from Ryo here of do what you need to do to make your product the best it can be. So that's a long-winded like advice to myself. So this one again, like advice from Calvin, views on community systems. And this is where we're going to start talking about material UI. I think that there are excellent systems out there. Some of my favorite ones are Radix is excellent. I would encourage you to, my browser's not full screen. I'd encourage you to check out Radix, in particular, their colors, and specifically within colors, it's this documentation at the top. Because I personally believe we don't need all these colors. Every system that goes out and builds 10 variations of every color, we don't need them. We basically need a background, we need a border, we need a foreground. And this is still like a large set of colors, but I would take a lot of inspiration from how they've documented this to how you might pull that into your own system. You might not be able to see that very well, so just zoom in. You can see there's labels, backgrounds, interactive components, borders, solid colors, and accessible text. Go and check out Radix. Additionally, I've now forgotten the name of it. There's another one which I love, which is forgotten. I'll come back to that in a second. So check that out. On Material UI, I downloaded a version of it, and it proved what I thought I didn't like about it. It's fine. Like, thousands of companies use it, but the reason I would be hesitant is because all of this is one component, and that makes me kind of scared because adoption to me is going to be low. And so if we look at this alert, you will see that we've got quite a few options in the side panel, but within here, I can choose error, warning, info, and success. But to me, they're different components. And as a designer, I need to be able to find that component fast. So if I go to the assets panel, search for alert, these, let me just show, there we go. I'm getting a red alert here. But what if I wanted the yellow one? Do I know I can get that in the red one? Or am I going to have to fiddle around to get to that point that I need to get? Additionally, we've got all these variations of like field, outline, standard. Maybe they're just separate components. So what if all these dividing lines, I wouldn't go that far, maybe the vertical dividing lines are actually separate components. And that would allow your designers to find alert warning, alert success visually in that file, instead of having to be like, oh, wait, what am I doing here? Oh, yeah, I'm going to find the success one. Yeah, right. Actually, no, I need the out. It's so much time I'm wasting trying to figure out what component I need in my system versus just being able to find it in that list. So every single second that we're wasting is a second that somebody's going to think, this design system is not working for me. I'm going to make my own. Matan's handed up.
Yeah, I have a question about that one.
Yeah.
So we're always, when we're trying to think about building like new components, so we're always trying to think how will that be in parity with the code?
Yeah.
In order to like align the two together.
Mhm.
And that's where we're always in a pickle. It's
Agreed.
not in parity like ever.
Yeah.
And
So my perspective on that is that these things get built once. So to me, that is a documentation opportunity. So this like grid is really, really nice. Maybe that's the handoff of permutations in this component, but then post handoff and like build is the designer just needing to work at speed. And does a naming convention perhaps indicate something? So if we look at this alert, what if this was called alert warning? Oops, I flipped it. And what if we had, let's assume these are different components. Alert, error. My developer's still seeing alert, but they're getting an indication of the prop that is going to be selected from that naming convention. I might just zoom in here as well. In the layers panel, they're getting an indication of something. So if these are separate components, I'm still able to communicate centrally what it is. It's an alert. The developer's like, it's an alert, I know that. And if there's a naming convention internally that indicates what the changes of that are, maybe this is like alert standard. Maybe this is error outline. Outlined. To me, this is easier to comprehend. The parity, again, in code, these are probably one component. But if we go back to here, I think I have an example. Notification. Yeah. This could be built in many different ways. This could be one component. It could be two components. It could be infinitely different. On the code side, there's just like variant prop. I would personally prefer to split these up, but we decided to keep them the same component because there's only two. As if that blew up to a bunch of different ones, I'd probably reconsider it. Something that I lightning. What I was kind of reassured by is that the Salesforce Lightning design system does follow the methodology of splitting things up. So these are separate components. So I would align with this. There's my personal hunch, but also it's kind of reassuring that Salesforce are doing that. And the documentation, they're explaining what the code side of that is. This is all down to how many components you have. If you are this big, I'd just be a little concerned. But if you are maybe this big, different story, and it might be fine. If your team is 100 people, this might not work. If your team is 2 people, this might work. So those things are sort of balance and juggle up and down to know when or not to split. And that could just be an exercise that is done internally of, hey, go and make this component or design a success screen and just watch people how they do it. And if they're struggling with component changing, we've got a problem. We can probably fix it by splitting or naming conventions or documentation or any of those things. It's one of those end of the spectrum discussions and decisions. I think I might skip something here. Right. What are some UI elements that are standard but people fail to include but tend to recognize deep in the project? I think designers, at least a bunch of times I've seen, is not knowing the HTML version of a component or what it would be in HTML and building something different. Like an example of that is an icon that you can click. An icon that you can click like this. As a designer, you might just like drop an icon into the file, but developer needs to know that it's an icon button. So you need to build an icon button component and then use that in your dialog or that in your close icon instead of just dropping the icon, because that's not how it's going to be built. Anything that is like an icon that can be clicked is probably an icon button. So everywhere you see an icon like that is probably backed by a central icon button component. And you'll notice that is like positioned absolutely in here outside the grid. And that's because of that. The actual icon itself is way smaller, but the icon button itself has a much larger target. So that's something I see is pretty common. Also, just general structure, I think, or thinking about flexibility when it comes to auto layout. Auto layout can be really, really useful, but it can also be a pain if it is not as flexible as people want. And so like a decision about, it's basically a decision, like is something really hyper flexible? Can it be used in mobile and desktop? Or do we just ship mobile and desktop versions of this component? My preference, honestly, would be the latter, because the mobile and desktop versions might have different structure, or they might have different elements by default. They might even be like platform specific. But I would probably lean on flexibility in different component versus like one mega component that can do everything. Also on that one, if you have I don't think I've got an example. Let's say you have a component that has a variant for mobile, tablet, desktop, or all of them have those variants. You then like combine what component 1, component 2, component 3. And this is the mobile variant, mobile variant, mobile variant. Whoops. What's stopping someone accidentally toggling the desktop variant? Then you've got these mixed states of components in your design, and nobody would notice if they look similar. So there's like protection here of what happens if something goes in incorrect into that design and gets pushed to production. In a more practical sense, this might be like you have an iOS and an Android component variant set, and they might be different, but you're allowing people to toggle between those two different things, and you might accidentally push the wrong thing to production. I'll just kind of protect myself on that one.
Luis,
Yeah.
please a question. On that icon button that you were showing to us, they need to have hidden accessible labels with a copy that clearly tells the user what they do, because the user that don't have a site, they can't see what the button really do. They can't listen to the button. So we have to have an accessible label in that.
Yeah.
Do you think it's the design team responsibility to provide this? How the component should be read by non-seeing users?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in that instance, icon button. In that instance, I'll use an annotation. So I'll pull up the annotations. I can't see it, the menu. The Google Meet is on the way. Shift T, yeah. I'd put up an annotation and I'd describe in here what the area label is of that component. And then that gets, when my developers are inspecting, they can see that there. So this is basically documentation that I'd add to that component. That is in the main component, but in the actual instance of it, we would, I could do it there too. So here's another example of like a dialogue, which has the same thing. I can add my annotation, label, blah, blah, in here, and add that there. Or if you work differently, if you use tickets, like a Jira ticket or something, you can add the information there. But I think it's way tighter in here if you add it for your developers. Not. Did that answer the question?
Great approach. Thank you.
No problem.
I can add one more thing for annotations. So the new Figma MCP reads those annotations, and then you can use them as like a way to explain like the interactivity or the usage of like each component inside of a component. And it works really well.
Nice, thank you.
Hi, Luis. I have a question around, I guess, going back to the components and having different ones for iOS and Android. How would you handle that for different languages? So at the moment, I'm designing in English first and then into Arabic. And I was wondering if you have, I guess, any suggestions for designing components between languages.
Yeah, so that is where the advice changes, English to Arabic, because English to Arabic, I would have a variant toggle for language. I spoke with a bank in the Middle East last week, and they set it up like that, so I'm confident that it's working for them. It's just that the components get much larger. So if we take, and this is where like this consideration again, we have to consider that. So that's why I probably boil components down to their minimal viable component, and then set up my right to left as a variant of that. English, Arabic. Bruno's shaking his head. Please, Bruno, jump in.
Sorry, no, definitely. So basically, I'm leading a design system in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, great.
So basically, I'm working on that. So yes, variants is one approach, but the other one that I would recommend is using variables.
Mm-hmm.
So basically setting up the different collections modes for different languages and the toggles. But it's a little bit more complex than creating the variance itself.
Yeah, I would use that for simple strings. So if your designers don't necessarily need to change it very often, or if you don't have mixed casing. So if you have like, if you have something like this, totally fine to use as a variable. But if you have like this is bold, then you're not going to be able to do it. So just bear in mind those different casing levels. Then at a first level, a variable mode could be useful. But if it's unpredictable text, just bear that in mind.
Also, extra tip for Cathy is basically there are a couple of plugins that allow you to automatically generate RTL variants.
Oh, nice.
Awesome. Thank you guys. That's been super helpful.
Lucas.
Yes, a quick comment. Hello, everyone. Yes, I already had this experience with Arabic, and I mean, even the back button, right? Because as you know, all the construction also is different, right? For example, if in the West, right, we usually understand that the back is to the left, but in some use case we have the back to the right. I mean, I have created a long documentation for that. Maybe Bruno is facing the same. It's quite our brain freezes, right? Fries, I mean. That's it.
Yeah, it's tricky, and that's why different. To me, not too dissimilar to like the mobile desktop challenge of things being structurally different. To me, is the same challenge as left to right and right to left. You need to have different structure. So to me, that's a different component.
Exactly. Thank you.
Well, structure is in arrangement, not structure is in different things. Just to be clear. Cool. I think we spoke about Material UI. Yeah, let's move on. Okay. Helpful or fun workflows to make design system more intuitive. Is it how you structure them, document them? Yeah, so let's jump back to Material UI. It looks like I'm totally dragging them, but I promise you I'm not. This is an example. Like, this is actually a pretty minimal set of properties, but I've seen, and I've also built myself, examples where this is like 20 or 30 options that you can change on a component. And I would say just try not to do it. As soon as this, like, so we don't want a designer spending 90% of their time in like 15% of the window. That to me is just not a satisfying way to live. So we want people to be active. And to me, that means maybe hiding more things in the side panel and relying on people double clicking in to change properties. I don't have a problem with that. If we just allow the top level to be made in this example, maybe the top level is just success info error warning, and I double click in to change my icon. That workflow might make me less overwhelmed by that initial loading state and more inclined to use that component out of the box. That's not necessarily a workflow change, but just something I found would be pretty useful when using stuff. Additionally, like the description field in a component. I don't know if I have one. Let's have a look. Yeah, so like this field up here is a gold mine of information on how to use something if you use it. So there's a lot of opportunity to add in tips or tricks or advice in here. Maybe it's that accessible label challenge. Like here's our guidelines on how to write an accessible label. You add that to the icon button, someone can read it and write their own label. So not necessarily fun things here, but just like some things that I think are sort of table stakes for that. Anything else? Honestly, the assets panel thing that I mentioned earlier. So searching for button in here shows me all the different kind of, like, you can see I'll split these up as well. But this to me is more intuitive than the example where we've got, what was it, alert? Where we've got this. It just feels more intuitive. Although I can click this, I can customize the thing, I'm still spending loads of time just like optimizing stuff rather than dragging it in and moving on with my day. So this one is like an extension of that earlier question on Material UI. If you're at a point where you are developing outside of the system that you've built, that to me means it's a good thing. It means that the business, or at least the team, is being successful and you're being forced to think wider. The only thing I would consider is at what point does design and engineering debt become a limitation in what you're doing? They are pretty flexible and extendable, so I wouldn't be too concerned. And a lot of the time, this is driven by an engineering decision. So design might not have the power of saying, hey, we're going to build our own system, but in collaboration, you might. And on the replacing part, I'm not sure I'd approach it as replacing, but maybe there's just like custom packages that you develop using your foundation of like variable styles that you have in that original system. So if we say we've got Material UI foundations, and then components, I might consider like brand A, that's my brand, components as a separate thing, but we're feeding it with those foundations. And over time, we might actually make this what just happened? I lost my screen. We might make this larger and larger to the point where this is maybe redundant. And that's like a long-term replacement or extension. But you still got this at the base. But design debt and engineering debt is very important to consider. Okay, Adana. It's often a good idea to get developers involved early. What are some questions you have found useful to ask or things to do to get that collaboration going? The reality is, like, similar to very early on, the engineers also want to be efficient. and probably also building systems in a certain flavor. So I would actually say lean into the engineering side rather than asking engineers to come into the design side, just to see what's going on over there. Because you might find they already build components, and they probably do. It's very hard to not build efficient code. So I think that attend engineering planning meetings, engineering retrospectives, look at engineering tickets if you can, try and figure out what's going on, speak to an engineer, become a buddy, front-end engineer, and just ask questions like, how are you building and how are you systematizing anything that is being done? Do you have tokens in your setup? The answer is probably like, yeah, or we're working on it, or we'd like to. If the answer is we'd like to, then you can work on that together. If the answer is yes, then we need to find out what they are. And maybe we can import those into Figma or into your design tool. So I'd say lean more into the engineering side first, because we want it to be a collaboration in both directions. And what I find is sometimes limiting is that designers think the design system is a designer's job, but in reality it's not. They're contributing to a larger system collaboratively. And engineers have probably made a decision already on what platform or framework to use, and you don't know what that is yet. So go and find out what it is. It might be Material UI, it might be Tailwind, it might be custom, it might be something else. So find out what that is, go and read the documentation of that framework, and then start to retrospectively bring that into the design organization. Balancing consistency with flexibility. For example, how do you keep things organized while still giving designers room to customize components when needed? Like rigidity and flexibility, I think, is like the key question in any component decision. It's like, how customizable should this be? Let's take, so we were looking at something earlier. We were looking at those forms. These are like fixed. This is a shipping information form. This is a contact form, login form. The reality is this is not going to change very often. At that moment, make a component that is fixed and named like that. So form login tells me exactly what form login does. On the flexibility side, all of those elements can be customized or combined into a separate pattern. So a designer can either take the flexible option or take the fixed option, but you're supporting both. But like I mentioned earlier, you don't want to end up in a situation where you're having to build every single permutation of every single pattern, because that's inefficient. So at that moment, when you start to feeling like that design system is the blocker, how can you help other people make their own versions of this and contribute that to the system? That's when we go into contribution. And also you might end up realizing that maybe the input field needs to be changed. Maybe people aren't aware that this should be changed. Maybe your default version actually has like this as the label, and people are thinking that's a first name input field. But keeping things generic allows people to understand that it can be customized. But it kind of does come down to how fixed is the content. If it's very fixed, just make a component for that and ship that as part of the system. Oh, we just kind of addressed this like overwhelming properties panel. That's why I'd just definitely consider not moving everything up to the top level, encouraging people to investigate the innards of a component. Figma's been releasing a lot of quality life updates. Is there a way to future-proof design system decisions? I would just say you don't need to adopt everything immediately. The things that are being released, at least the last handful of things, pretty much since variants, I feel, nothing's been breaking changes. They're sort of additive to a system. So if you're in a frame where you are moving at speed, you're shipping work, things are fine, I would probably wait until there's another major version of a design system before you start to embed or update your components to adopt this new stuff. Additionally, some of the stuff might not be ready for you. So Grid, as an example, is probably not ready for a production design system yet. It will be, but at the moment it's not. So I would wait until there is a moment when we can adopt things in that way and not just rush into it. If you're rushing into these adoption, there's probably other things you should be focusing on in your roadmap that mean that are being distracted from. So just be patient. Variables is another good one where people are, as you can imagine, desperate for it, understandably, and people rushed into it and then had to reverse out and undo a lot of changes that kind of broke the system. So just take your time, plan these things out, and over time you can adopt them. What's the future of design systems with AI tools? Again, if you would have asked me this 3 months ago, I would have probably been very cynical about the state of the industry. But I'm feeling more optimistic at the moment. And like I said at the start, they're more important than ever. Because at the moment, the state of play is that you can build very good prototypes with AI generation tools, like excellent prototypes, but they might not feel like your product. And it would take you a lot of time to prompt and make them feel like your product, because there's kind of a gap in the system being fed into it. At the moment when that happens, we are on a rocket ship of prototype enhancement. So at the moment, we're kind of in the early days, I guess, of like prototypes V3 or 4 or whatever number it is, where you can get interactive stuff done really quickly to validate a single idea. Once we feed that with design systems, a designer's job will change forever, or a prototyper's job will change forever, where you are backing a coded prototype with your own Figma system, and like, how amazing would that be? So the future is faster, it's more interactive and more dynamic, and that you're going to be spending less time dragging noodles around a screen or playing with variables to build complex but pseudo-complex prototypes. So like very optimistic in where that's going. There's another question about this later on, which I can add more flavor to. Oh, it's right there. It's the next question. Potential for AI tools integrated into Figma to streamline tedious foundational work. This, I think, is where APIs are like fundamental to making your lives easier, which are also like APIs are easier to use now with AI too. Building plugins in Figma is a very easy task now that you can use AI to do them. And that means you can remove these tedious things in an afternoon from your life, rather than spending days or weeks on things that are just kind of dull or mundane. For example, like batch renaming things. If you have 1,000 variables, that could take you quite a long time to batch rename stuff. Or you could write a very quick script with the help of AI to do that in your file in a very short space of time. So this is another thing that I'm really confident of, is that designers just being empowered to build quick snippets that enable them to work faster and more efficiently. And I'm seeing it personally, and it just made my life a lot easier, because I can't tell you the amount of React courses that I've bought and never taken. Just don't do it. And I feel like I'm able to bypass this. Bruno, yeah.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on that. Basically, that's what I'm feeling. So every designer now needs to worry about turning into design engineering, right? Having to learn at least prompt engineering, right? And then a little bit of code.
Yeah, I do have a problem with the name design engineer, but we can talk about that another time. And it's not every designer, by the way. This might be the design systems team, who are typically technical people. So it might just be that you and your team are more empowered to push yourselves closer to the engineering side, or just a curious designer. There's all other aspects of the job, like analyzing research can be done a lot faster. Whether it's accurate or not, I'm not too sure. But we're also going to be entering worlds where you can iterate on a design faster.
Exactly.
Not necessarily a technical job, but it's using technical things to do it. So there's lots to be optimistic about. It's just like the job changes every couple of years, right?
Exactly.
And we need to lean into what's happening. Don't shy away from. I was rejecting AI for like 2 years, and now I'm very firmly leaning in, because this is just what's happening right now.
I'm in the same boat, actually.
High five on that.
Having to test every single AI kind of software out there.
Oh, cool.
Whatever.
Nice. Question from Pedro. The accessible touch targets. I think we kind of covered that with the icon button. I'll just make sure that they're like absolutely positioned in that. If it's the same thing that we were looking at, yeah, like this kind of situation where it's pumped up to the top. Absolutely. Whether that be coded like that, I'm not actually sure. But this allows us to position things where we want. I'm probably not answering the question in full, so feel free to follow up after if you need a bit more information. I think because we covered the labels too. Oh, static colors. This is a good one. So there's definitely scenarios where you have a light background with a gray button or something, and then in dark mode, you might need to just keep that gray button fixed as that color. And I'll just use a naming convention that makes sense to you. I can't remember what one I've used before. It might have just been more primitive in naming convention. So although we have like primitives should be hidden and semantics should be the only thing we use, it might just be something like, I'm just going to try and think off the top of my head. It might just be something like background dark. And that would allow you to be very intentional about what it is. But in reality, you've probably got something like background input or background button dark, because that's probably the thing that you're having, or you might even just flip the naming convention, button background dark, and then button background primary whatever. And then when you flip to your modes, you might just have like pink 700, and something like 200, and then this one might just be gray 500 in both. So I'll just use a naming convention that is very explicit. And although this kind of probably goes against what people would expect, I can read that and know exactly what's going to happen. It's going to be dark. If this is a scenario. If it's red, then it might just be red, and that is fine. If it works for the system, that's fine. You might have different colored reds though. Yeah, so in that scenario, you'd have like hover, active, whatever, as extensions of that one. Okay, solo designer working on fast-paced projects that require quick delivery. You rely on a simple system like color, typography, spacing. Oh, this is a good one. So sometimes you create stuff that you end up never using. This to me, I do this all the time, where I'll try and make the system first and then design and be like, actually, all of that is incorrect. I need to use different type sizes, different line heights, different colors, different spacing than what I thought I did originally. So for that, I would actually work in reverse, build the designs, then systematize it so you know what you're using. If you're not using something, I wouldn't necessarily say delete it. Because you're the only person doing it, no harm. Just remove what you don't need so that it doesn't get confusing. You can just layer up when you need it later on. But again, that's very common scenario of trying to like anticipate what you need. I do the same with components, where I'll make hover state, focus state, active state of loads of things, and then be like, actually, I'm never going to need a hover state. Why did I spend 5 minutes making that? I'll just start minimal all the time and layer up. And this one also, material design is infinitely complex. And I would probably advise to not try and replicate it, because they have built a system for everybody. And therefore, that might actually sometimes mean it's a system for nobody. You're building a system for your specific product. So I just like get very tightly scoped on what you need to ship for that thing to get over the line. That might mean you're really inefficient and you build loads of things that are kind of similar or duplicates of the same thing. And that's also fine. If you're still a business that is struggling to get revenue through the door, let's just get those designs out and try and get customers and try and get users, and we can refactor and refine things later on. I'd focus on the business and focus less on like design system consistency at this moment. Somebody's hand up somewhere. Yeah.
Okay. Bruno again.
Yeah.
I guess another follow-up, because that's a funny one. How do you handle when you have a stakeholder or a C-level telling you that why not making it our system like Material does?
Yeah. To be honest with you, like, why are they concerned? But practically, it would be like, what parts of Material do you like, and why do you like them? And it might just be that it's like the rounded corners or something, or that it has 10 different themes, which would take a really long time to figure out, actually, in the design side. But trying to like work back like you would researching a user problem, is like, what is it about Material that we want to replicate? Is it that they have a documentation website? It might be that it's just public. Like, okay, well, let's spend 3 months doing that. We're going to have to deprioritize the roadmap to get there. And yeah, just try and understand. It might be the color palette. It might be whatever, spacing, the font even. But I know what you mean. It's a hard one when there's a very clear desire. Even just when you're doing freelance client work, sometimes they know exactly what they want to build, and you just have to build it. And sometimes not try and drive your own agenda design. Yeah. I would say it's not worth your time as a solo designer to build a fully fledged documented design system. I'd say focus on, like I said, user growth and user acquisition, and lean into sales, lean into marketing, lean into writing more, documenting, getting around the business. It's just going to be way more useful for your career than trying to build a design system in a tiny team. The basic style guide will get you very far. So just lean on that. It's going to be really useful. And yeah, definitely build components as you go. You don't know what you need yet until the feature comes up. So you just build it in that moment and capture it. This is a similar question to like the first one about colors and type, where you build stuff you don't need. That's definitely going to happen, but you don't know that until you get to that point. So I just take all of this as a learning exercise. Hey, I built all this extra custom functionality that we didn't end up using. How can I be more efficient next time? Maybe the brief wasn't clear enough. Maybe we didn't tightly scope the requirements, and that would help you become clearer and in what you need to build. But also, iterations are a requirement of design. It might just be that you build, let's go back to this Notion thing. Like, you build a really messy file with tons of components that you don't end up needing. Maybe just make a new file for when you are ready to start productionizing this, and you take whatever components you do need to the new file, archive this one, and just park it somewhere else. Also, using ChatGPT for your questions is illegal. You shouldn't be doing that. Okay, Giancarlo. Variables. You have quoted me here. That's dangerous. Hey. Variables in different library files does not work as expected when you try to swap. Indeed, you cannot swap variable files. You can only swap variable modes. So that has a massive impact on what I'm assuming is a multi-brand approach here. Let me just have a read. Yeah, it's not possible to do a library swap with variables, which limits what I think you're trying to do is like maybe client work, where you're trying to swap an entire system to a new client or something. And well, unfortunately, what you have to do is duplicate the library and change all the values. So that's where that is a good example of where having all the variables and all the components in the same file makes sense. What I would say to make your life a little bit easier is in your variables, in your primitives, I would call the brand colors brand instead of a color. And then you just manage that brand ramp. And you can have as many brands as you want in here. Then the semantic side, you can swap out the brand color. That instead of searching gray or pink or green or whatever, brand is just an easier way to manage that. It doesn't exactly answer the question because it's not as scalable as you want. Figma's working on a feature to make that easier, but unfortunately, you just have to maintain duplicate files. Oh, it's this. Yes, this is what we're working on. The workaround depends on how many brands you've got, because you would be limited. Let me just pull up a file, actually. So this kind of workaround is not necessarily a workaround, but just an idea of using so primitives as usual, and then primitives go into a system in dark, then system goes into scheme where you have different schemes. The system is where you have your brands. So you can have 4 here, you can have 4 here, you can have 4 here, and you can interconnect all these different things, but only you can have sort of 4 brands. So I would consider primitives with modes for each brand, and I'd also consider semantic for that too. But yeah, it's not necessarily possible in that limited system. Hey, Mercedes. Design debt. I would prioritize the most used component for design debt to be fixed on. And you might end up finding, so basically an audit of the system, and that might be going through files, it might be going through the live website to see what the most common usages are, and then fixing those, and then prioritizing the rest over the course of months to go and fine tune those ones. Rather than trying to do like a one-shot design debt refactor, it might be that the menu gets done first, the navigation gets done second, the footer gets done third, the card gets done fourth, and you slowly refactor all these different components over the course of that, like months, and then you get more efficient that way. So you're basically handing over new component versions independently. The way that I'd handle that probably is it's hard to know, but if you're working in different like a different structure for that new component, I'd probably have component like existing. I'd probably create a new component, call it v2, and then refactor this component, and then release this and archive this one. So over time, we're moving slowly to a new set of components. When I archive this in Figma, I would I'd make the frame of the component red so that when it gets searched for in the assets panel, the background of it is red, so people know it's archived. Additionally, I would rename it to something like deprecated. So there's a couple of things that would indicate this is not for use, not using anymore. Then we use component v2. Lucas, why do you think we are still so dependent on plugins and different ways to export design tokens? Figma is building a import-export for variables, and that will help a lot. The longer answer is that we had to rebuild all of our design systems architecture in Figma, and that took a really long time. So the features that you're discussing a couple of times already is just had to get delayed because the engineering team had to rebuild the foundation, which isn't great, but that work is nearly done, which means we can now reprioritize to those other features that people are mentioning. So it's coming. How do I see this scenario in which would be the perfect world? So the perfect world basically is like import, export in JSON format to whatever you want. If you're aligning to the spec, like the token specification. I know this is plugging myself here, but I built a plugin called CSS Variables Import Export. So you can move your variables across files using this. And so if I do this, convert to CSS, this gives you all the different variables. You can copy them, you can export them as a CSS file, and then move them to a different file. So like that to me just kind of works. They get disconnected, so don't expect them to be connected to your components when you do that, but just something that's kind of cool. This one, Figma make organizing, generating variables, probably eventually, like we released the MCP server yesterday, which allows you to use Figma basically in your code editor. So it's like not too far away from a world where that is going to be possible, where you can bi-directionally synchronize components, data across different tools. Parametric components, I assume this is referring to that Mr. Biscuit thing that he was doing recently, where he used variable modes and variants for like interconnected components. We would actually say that we would not recommend that because it forces people to look in different places for component properties. So at that stage, we're relying on people looking in the component properties panel for changing some things, and then the variable modes panel for changing other things. It just doesn't necessarily feel as usable as just supporting more variants in your system. So I think it's definitely like there's an over-engineering of components that can happen. However, if you're in a small team, that might be perfect for you. If you're in a large team, it might cause a lot of headaches. I think Caleb's hand is up.
Yes, sir. So we have some questions also on Luma. I don't know if you can attend to some of them. Some of them are a bit personal. Some people in our community too are somewhat beginners, so they have some questions that's around that. So
I didn't catch that. There's some
we can
questions. Sorry, questions where? Sorry?
You see, in Mike, some initially mentioned that we have some questions on Luma. The
Luma. Oh,
Yeah.
could somebody drop those into the file for me? I'm not sure if I have access to it.
Okay. Then I should drop them. Oh, okay, so I'll drop them into the file.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get into the meat of Lucas's question here. It seems like Figma created variables as a kickoff, but the environment still isn't ready. Yeah, so those, like I mentioned, that foundational work that has been done enables variables to move a lot faster. So hold tight. It's not far away. The next batch of updates, they're coming pretty soon. And thank you for the comment. What accessibility standards should all components meet? Well, in Europe, we have a pretty aggressive accessibility deadline of now, June, for websites to be compliant to a certain set of guidelines. So what I would say is just look at them, wherever you're selling, whatever market you're operating in, look at the guidelines for that market and try to abide by them. But to be honest with you, all text should be AA standard. All components should be semantic HTML. They should all have tab order by default. I think just generally good engineering practices should be a standard on every component. Whether that's easy or hard to do is a separate question. And whether it's your responsibility to put that into this, like the sprint, is also a separate question. But we can do as much as possible on the design side by documenting every decision to try and make sure it gets as accessible as possible. We spoke about AI a little bit, so maybe we can skip that one. Question from Gavin: do you ever build components with an emphasis on them working properly in a prototype? I prototype very rarely, to be honest. That might be because I don't do that much hands-on product design work anymore. A prototype is normally for like a micro interaction for me, or testing out a specific thing, like an accordion. How does that open? I might prototype that instead of it being like a click-through prototype. So yeah, sometimes I might do that, but it doesn't happen very often. And are they separate from in a separate library? Probably. If they're in like a production file, I would say build your prototype for that component in that file. And that sounds counterintuitive, but it allows you to be a little bit more flexible. So the reality is that you'll probably end up detaching that component, remaking a component, and then building the interaction in that design file to prove how it should work, if it's custom and not in the system. So it's like, yes and no. But things like hover states, that's probably in the library. Focus states, probably in the library. So if it needs to be interactive across different screens, it'll probably be local to a file. I have done Booleans for showing and hiding different things. I ended up just finding that the experience in the properties panel was not very nice. So what I do now is just build a component. And let me see if we have. Oh, I'm in the wrong place. Navigation. Maybe examples somewhere. Yeah, so I'm actually showing all of these. I thought, so what I'd normally do is actually just hide. So in this navigation pill list component, I would just hide a couple of them in here, and the designer can just make them visible when they want to use them, instead of using the properties panel for that. Because what you end up doing in that scenario is that you have to rename all these instances, like nav pill 1, nav pill 2, nav pill 3, and renaming an instance can sometimes break overrides. So I much prefer to just have them hidden in that component, and people toggle it on and off if they want it in the main thing. Okay. All right. Currently working on some animated components. I want to ensure smooth handoff. How do you recommend documenting? This is tricky. Firstly, I would ask the engineering team if they use any specific animation library, or if they want to use an animation library, because the reality is they probably do. And I've done it before where I've spent a lot of time making a custom animation, and then the engineers have said, hey, we're actually using this JavaScript library for animation. We can't do what you want to do. So I'd first get that question answered. Are you using, or would you prefer to use a specific animation library? If the answer is yes, go and research that library and just pick one of those and maybe try and replicate that in Figma. If you're building something totally custom, then I'd probably use an annotation and just describe exactly what you want to happen. Alternatively, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a second because I'm going to go and pull up a different file. I don't want to share something I shouldn't do. So 1 second. Okay, I've got it. Okay, this is the FigJam High 5 and the handoff file. So I'm just going to hide this grid here. And you'll see how the designer prepared their file for handoff for that FigJam High 5. So this is like documentation. So I would encourage you to do something probably quite similar. Well, animating, but describing the animation so your engineer can see all those details when you want to do it. So this is actually just really nice design work. You can see here. So I'd encourage you to do that too. Okay, where are we? Over here. How do you hand off to ensuring expected behaviors? This is documentation too. So I would list out all the different permutations. Do I have an example? Maybe the lightning one might have it. Oh, this is like really good documentation here. It's just like listing out exactly what should happen, but still could be more. So this is just really nice stuff of basically they're making sticker sheets of what might happen with these components. So people can just see how might this be used instead of just handing over this. It's like an example of this in practice with naming ideas too. Yeah, really nice stuff. And then we will get to it, Trenton, don't worry. Multi-dimensional variable implementations, multi-brand, multi-mode. This is a question that is entirely dependent on how many brands you're supporting. If the answer is more than like, there we go, 17, it's hard. I would, like a couple of questions that I normally ask is, is every brand aware of every other brand? And then does every designer design across every brand? And does every engineer build for every brand? Because if the answer is like yes, 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 then that is definitely like a single multi-dimensional one system for all situation. If the answer is like to the third one, probably, do engineers build across all of them? It might be no. In which case that suggests to me that maybe there are actually subsystems going on, but there might be like a shared foundation of primitives only. In Figma at the moment, this is difficult, I'll be honest, until we do get to that extended collections feature that we're releasing. And unfortunately, you either have to do something like use Token Studio to manage that, or you have to maintain multiple identical systems with different mode options. So like chunking a set of brands into one file, chunking a set of brands into another file, and basically maintaining duplicates of the same thing. And so it's pretty clunky, but like the immediate option will be Token Studio.
Good to know. Appreciate that.
Yeah. We have 5 minutes left, and I think there are some questions in Luma which I can't see. Does anybody know what they are? If not, maybe I can answer them afterwards. I can drop people a message or add them to the file and people can come and check it out again. Might be worth it. Yeah, all good. All good. Oh, there's a lot of chat. Didn't see this. Cool. Well, thanks everybody. I hope you had fun. Thanks for joining us this evening, this morning, this afternoon. You know where to find me if you have any other questions, and we should do this again if people are interested.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Luis.